The mid-afternoon sun cut a sharp, bright line across the polished floor of the restaurant, catching the dust motes that danced in the silence of the upper dining room. It was the kind of place that didn't need to be loud to announce its worth. The heavy crystal glasses, the crisp, white tablecloths that never seemed to wrinkle, and the hushed tones of the diners did all the talking. For Arthur, this was just another Tuesday. He sat at the best table in the house, the one with the view of the city street, though he hadn't looked out once since he sat down. He was too busy looking at his watch, a heavy gold piece that clicked softly every time he moved his wrist. Arthur was a man who treated time like an employee he was constantly disappointed in. If it wasn't moving fast enough, he yelled at it. If it dragged, he fired it. Today, it was dragging. He had been waiting for 10 minutes, and to him, that was an insult. He tapped his fingers on the mahogany table, a rhythm that sounded like a warning. He wasn't a patient man by nature, and money had only made his temper shorter and his expectations higher. He believed that the world revolved around the efficiency of service, and right now, the service was failing him. On the other side of the room, moving like a ghost in the shadows of the wait station, was Sophie. She was 24, though her eyes looked older today. She had the kind of tiredness that didn't go away with a good night's sleep. It was a heaviness that settled in the bones from carrying too many responsibilities at once. Her uniform was black and pristine, but the cuffs were starting to fray slightly, a detail she tried to hide by pulling her sleeves down over her wrists. She had 3 exams to study for and a stack of bills at home that grew taller every month. This job was her lifeline, but days like this made it feel like a noose around her neck. Sophie saw the man at the corner table raise his hand. It wasn't a wave. It was a flick of the index finger, sharp and dismissive. She took a deep breath, smoothing down her apron, and pasted on the smile she practiced in the mirror. It wasn't a real smile, but it was the one that paid the rent. She walked over, her steps light on the thick carpet, trying to ignore the way her feet throbbed in her shoes. "Good afternoon, sir," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I apologize for the wait. Can I start you off with something to drink?" Arthur didn't look up immediately. He finished typing something into his phone, the clicking sound harsh in the quiet air, before slowly locking eyes with her. He scanned her face, then her nama tag, then back to her face. He didn't see a student doing her best. He saw a cog in a machine that wasn't turning fast enough. "You can start by telling me why it took so long for you to get here," Arthur said. His voice wasn't a shout, but it had a cold edge to it, like ice forming on a puddle. "I have been sitting here for 10 minutes. Is that the standard here? Or am I just lucky?" Sophie felt the familiar heat of embarrassment climb up her neck, but she kept her hands folded neatly in front of her. "I am very sorry, sir. We are a bit short-staffed today. I can assure you, your order will be taken care of personally." Arthur let out a short, humorless laugh. He picked up the heavy leather menu, flipping it open with a snap. "Personally. That is comforting." Didn't look at the food. He looked at her over the top of the menu. "Let's see if you can handle this. I want the sparkling water. It's on page 4. The French one. Not the Italian. And I need a glass of the Cabernet. The 2016, do not bring me the 2015. I won't drink it." Sophie nodded, her memory holding the order. "The French sparkling water and the 2016 Cabernet? Certainly. And would you like to see the appetizer menu while you wait?" Arthur closed the menu and tossed it onto the table, sliding it toward her. "I know what I want. But I want to see if you can pronounce it. It's the beef bourguignon. Now I know that might be a bit of a mouthful for you, so take your time." Sophie hesitated for a fraction of a second. She knew exactly how to pronounce it. She had taken French classes for years before she had to drop out to work full-time. But the way he was looking at her, with that smirk that suggested she was barely literate, made her stumble. "Beef bourguignon," she said, tripping slightly over the middle syllable. It was a small mistake, one anyone could make. Arthur's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it, only satisfaction. "Close," he said, drawing the word out. "It's bourguignon." The N is silent. Really, they should teach the staff these things before they let them on the floor. It confuses the customers. The table next to them went quiet. An older couple glanced over. Their sympathy clearly was Sophie, but they looked away quickly, not wanting to get involved. Sophie felt the sting of tears in her eyes, but she blinked them back furiously. She wouldn't cry here. Not in front of him. "I will correct that, sir," she said, her voice tighter now. "Thank you for the lesson." "Oh, don't mention it," Arthur said, waving his hand as if he were doing a charity service. "We all have our roles, don't we? You do the serving, and I do the paying. It seems fair." He picked up his phone again, dismissing her as abruptly as he had summoned her. Sophie stood there for a heartbeat longer, looking at the top of his head. She thought about the piano recital she had missed yesterday because she had to cover a shift. She thought about the complex compositions she used to play, the way the music felt like an escape from a world full of men like Arthur. But that felt like a different life now. Now, she was just the girl who couldn't pronounce the wine. She turned and walked away, clutching her order pad. As she moved toward the kitchen, passing the large black piano that sat silently in the corner, her fingers brushed against the cold wall. She felt small. She felt unseen. The restaurant was noisy again, the clatter of plates and the murmur of conversation filling her ears. But the only sound she could hear was Arthur's voice, mocking her, telling her exactly where she belonged in the world. Arthur watched her go, feeling a sense of grim satisfaction. He hated feeling ignored, and he had reasserted control over his little corner of the universe. He took a sip of the water that had been left by the busboy, swirling it in his glass. It was warm. He frowned. That was another problem for the waitress to fix. He leaned back, checking his watch again, completely unaware that the universe was about to shift the tune. And the girl he had just humiliated was the only one who could change it. The air in the restaurant had changed, or at least it felt that way to Sophie. It wasn't that the lighting had dimmed or that the temperature had dropped, but the atmosphere felt heavier, pressing down on her shoulders. She moved through the dining room like a diver holding her breath, trying to stay beneath the surface of notice. She dropped off the glass of Cabernet at Arthur's table without a word, placing the coaster down with precision to avoid even the slightest clink. He didn't look up. He was engrossed in a document on his tablet, scrolling with an aggressive flick of his finger. For a moment, Sophie thought about saying something thanking him for the lesson on pronunciation, or perhaps telling him that the wine was breathing perfectly, but she swallowed the words. They tasted like ash in her mouth. She wasn't there to talk. She was there to be invisible. That was the job. Be a ghost, bring the food, clear the plates, and vanish. She retreated to the service station, a small alcove hidden behind a large fern. There, she leaned against the counter for a second, pressing her palms into her eyes until she saw stars. The embarrassment from 10 minutes ago still burned hot on her cheeks, a sharp contrast to the cold, air-conditioned room. She could hear his voice in her head, that distinct, clipped tone correcting her. It wasn't just that he was rude. It was that he enjoyed it. He liked making her feel small. That was the part that stuck to her ribs like something she couldn't digest. Out on the floor, the restaurant was filling up. The lunch rush was beginning, bringing with it a cacophony of noises. The sharp hiss of the espresso machine from the bar cut through the low hum of conversation. A baby cried near the entrance, the sound high and piercing, quickly hushed by a mother. Silverware clattered against china, a constant rhythmic backdrop that usually signaled a busy, profitable day. But to Sophie, the noise just felt like noise. It was abrasive. She picked up a heavy pitcher of water and a stack of menus, forcing her legs to move. She had tables to serve. She had to focus. As she walked back into the main dining area, her eyes were drawn, as they always were, to the piano. It sat in the corner, bathed in a shaft of sunlight that illuminated every curve and angle of the black lacquer. It was a beast of an instrument, a concert grand that looked too big for the room. It was beautiful, terrifyingly so. Usually by this time of day, the bench would be occupied by Mr. Henderson, an older man with thinning white hair and a cardigan who played smooth jazz standards. He played with a gentle touch, music that you could ignore, music that politely asked you to enjoy your soup. But today, the corner was empty. The bench sat vacant, pushed slightly out, as if waiting for someone who never arrived. The lid was down, covering the keys like a coffin lid. turning the instrument into just another piece of expensive furniture. Sophie slowed her pace as she passed it. She knew Mr. Henderson was sick. She had heard the manager talking about it earlier that morning. They hadn't found a replacement yet. The silence in the corner felt wrong to her. It was like a missing heartbeat in the room. She stopped at a table near the window, pouring water for a young couple who were too busy looking at each other to notice her. They were holding hands across the table, their fingers intertwined. Sophie looked at them and felt a sudden, sharp pang of loneliness. She missed connection. She missed the feeling of being understood, of being seen as something other than a pair of hands carrying a tray. She finished pouring and moved on, her route taking her past the piano again. This time she stopped. The rush of the lunch crowd seemed to fade into the background, becoming a dull roar in her ears. She looked around. The other staff members were busy in the back. The customers were engrossed in their meals or their phones. Arthur was still at his corner table, now picking at a plate of food that had been delivered. While she was hiding in the station, Sophie took a step closer to the instrument. The black polish was so shiny she could see her own distorted reflection in the side-attired girl in a black uniform, looking pale and frizzy. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly. She wanted to touch it just to feel the cool wood, to remind herself of who she used to be. Her fingertips grazed the curved side of the piano. It was cold and smooth. The sensation sent a jolt through her, electric and startling. It had been months since she had touched a piano. The conservatory felt like a lifetime ago. A dream she had woken up from, to find herself in a reality of rent payments and overdue tuition notices. She used to sit in practice rooms for hours, her fingers bleeding, her heart soaring, feeling like she could speak a language that no words could ever capture. Now, her hands were rough from dish soap and sanitizing wipes. She looked at her cuticles, dry and ragged. These weren't pianist's hands anymore. They were workers' hands. Arthur's words echoed in her mind again. We all have our roles. He had decided her role. He had looked at her and seen a servant, someone whose only purpose was to bring him water and apologize for existing. He didn't know that she could hear the music in the silence between his sentences. He didn't know that she could look at a sheet of music and hear a symphony. To him, she was nothing. A flash of anger, hot and sudden, flared in her chest. It wasn't fair. It wasn't fair that he got to sit there and judge her, treat her like she was stupid just because she was wearing an apron. It wasn't fair that the piano sat there gathering dust while she ignored the music. Screaming inside her head, she looked over at Arthur. He was cutting a piece of steak, sawing at the meat with a knife that looked too sharp. He looked bored. He looked like a man who had everything and enjoyed nothing of it. Sophie's hand moved from the side, out of the piano to the keyboard lid. She knew she shouldn't. If the manager caught her, if Arthur looked up and saw her touching the expensive instrument, she would be fired on the spot. She couldn't afford to lose this job. She needed the money, but the silence in the corner was screaming at her. The music was the only thing she had left that was truly hers. They could take her uniform, they could take her tips, they could mock her accent, but they couldn't take the way she felt when the chords rang out. They couldn't take the melody. Her fingers curled under the edge of the lid. It was heavy. She lifted it just an inch, letting it rest on the small wooden stick that held it open. The keys were exposed, ivory and ebony, waiting in the shadows. They looked like old friends she had abandoned. She glanced around one last time. The coast was clear. The rush was peaking, but this corner was a pocket of stillness. She felt a pull, a gravity that was stronger than her fear. She didn't want to play a concert. She didn't want to show off. She just wanted to remind herself that she was real, that she wasn't just the girl who brought the water. Sophie took a breath, held it in her lungs until they ached, and slowly she lowered herself onto the bench. The velvet was soft against the back of her thighs. She was small on the big bench, a fragile figure in front of a giant beast. But for the first time all day, her back straightened. Her shoulders dropped. The tension in her jaw loosened. She lifted her hands. They were shaking just a little. But as she hovered them over the keys, the shaking stopped. The world narrowed down. The clattering plates, the murmuring voices, The man with the gold watch, all of it, disappeared. There was only the black and white. Arthur took a sip of his wine, grimacing slightly. He looked up, scanning the room for his waitress, ready to complain about the temperature of the food or the speed of the service. His eyes swept past the piano, then snapped back. He frowned, lowering his glass. He saw the girl, the waitress. The one who couldn't speak? She was sitting at the piano. He opened his mouth to call out, to demand to know what she thought she was doing, to tell her to get back to work. The insult was already forming on his tongue, sharp and ready. But before he could make a sound, before he could draw a breath to speak, her hands came down. The first chord didn't just sound. It seemed to cut through the air like a physical object, heavy and dark. It wasn't a note you heard. It was a vibration you felt in your chest, right next to your heart. Arthur froze, the rude comment dying in his throat, turning into a startled gasp that no one heard. His hands stayed in the air, his water glass halfway to the table. Forgotten. For a second, the entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. The clatter of silverware stopped. The murmured conversations tapered off into a confused silence. It was as if someone had suddenly turned down the volume on the world, leaving only the sound coming from the corner. Sophie didn't look around. She didn't check to see if people were staring. She didn't look at Arthur to see if he was angry. Her eyes were closed, her head bowed slightly, her dark hair falling forward to curtain her face. She was no longer in the restaurant. In her mind, she was back in her small, drafty dorm room. Or maybe sitting on a bench in a park where the noise of the city couldn't touch her. She was in the only place where she had ever felt truly safe. Her fingers moved across the ivory keys, finding the next notes with a certainty that contradicted her shaking hands of moments before. It was a piece by Chopin, a nocturne, but it wasn't the sweet, pretty lullaby most people expected. It was the E-flat major, but she played it with a slow, dragging sadness. She took her time with each note, letting the sound hang in the air until it faded into nothingness before daring to play the next one. It was the sound of longing. It was the sound of remembering something beautiful that you could never have again. Arthur slowly lowered his glass, the water inside trembling slightly. He stared at the back of the girl's head. Just moments ago, he had seen her as a prop, a background character in his own movie, a clumsy server who couldn't pronounce a name on a menu. He had placed a value on her, and that value was close to zero. But now, watching her hands dance over the keys, he felt a strange sensation creeping up his spine. It was doubt. He looked at the way her left hand grounded the rhythm with deep, resonant bass notes, while her right hand spun a delicate, weeping melody high above. It was intricate. It was complex. It was terrifyingly difficult to play, yet she made it look as natural as breathing. He knew about difficulty. Arthur spent his life analyzing problems, dissecting deals, looking for the weak points in a contract. He knew complexity when he saw it, and what he was seeing now was a level of mastery that couldn't be faked. You couldn't learn to play like this in a week. You couldn't learn this in a year. This required thousands of hours, a lifetime of discipline, kind of dedication he had never possessed. The young couple by the window had stopped holding hands. They were turned completely around in their chairs, watching her. The mother with the crying baby was now standing still, rocking the infant gently, listening. Even the chef had come out of the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron, standing in the doorway with a look of proud confusion on his face. Sophie's music began to swell. The gentle sadness started to build, rising like a tide. Her fingers moved faster, the notes cascading down the scale like rain, though the air was dry and still. She hit a dissonant chord, a clash of sounds that made the listeners wince, but then resolved it instantly into something so pure and sweet that it almost hurt to hear. It was the sound of frustration. It was the feeling of being trapped. Arthur felt a lump form in his throat, unbidden and unwanted. He watched the way her shoulders hunched forward, the tension visible in her black blouse. She was pouring something into the music, something she couldn't say with words. She was pouring out the shame of being mocked, the exhaustion of working 2 jobs, the grief for a future she had lost. He thought about the way he had spoken to her. We all have our roles. The words came back to him. But now they sounded hollow, like a lie he had told himself to feel superior. He had assumed her role was to serve him because she had no other value. He had assumed that because she wore a worn uniform, her mind was worn too. But as the music surged, filling the high ceiling with sound, he realized he was the one who was small. He was the one who was lacking. He had money in the bank, stocks in the market, and a watch that cost more than the car outside. But he couldn't do this. He couldn't make a room full of strangers stop and feel. He couldn't speak a language that bypassed the ears and went straight to the soul. He was just a man eating lunch, while she was a creator. The music reached a climax, storm of notes that rolled through the room like thunder. Sophie's hands were a blur, moving with a power that seemed impossible for someone so small. She wasn't just hitting the keys. She was striking them, demanding every ounce of sound the piano could give. It was fierce and angry and utterly beautiful. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the storm broke. The tempo slowed. The volume dropped, turning from a roar back into a whisper. The melody returned, simple and lonely. She played the final notes one by one, letting the silence stretch out between them, until there was nothing left but the memory of the sound. She struck the last chord, a deep, resonant harmony that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. And then she lifted her hands off the keys. The silence that followed was heavier than the silence before. It was a sacred silence, the kind that follows a prayer. No one moved. No one dared to clap, for fear of breaking the spell. It felt as if the entire room was waiting to see if she would play again, or if she would disappear. Sophie sat on the bench, her chest heaving slightly, her hands resting in her lap. The rush of adrenaline was fading, replaced by a cold wave of reality. She slowly opened her eyes and looked down at her hands. They were red from the exertion, the veins in her wrists standing out. She looked at the keys, no longer seeing them as friends, but now as the dangerous thing they were, temptation she couldn't afford. She had done it. She had crossed the line. She had touched the piano. She had played in the middle of her shift. Slowly, she turned her head. Her eyes swept across the room, taking in the stunned faces, the open mouths, the tears glistening in the eyes of the woman by the window. And finally, her gaze met Arthur's. He was staring at her, his mouth slightly open, his water glass abandoned on the table. He didn't look angry anymore. He didn't look superior. He looked stripped bare, like he had seen a ghost. He looked at her with a mixture of awe and utter confusion, as if he were looking at a stranger who had been wearing a mask of a waitress. Sophie felt the heat of embarrassment return, hotter than before. She hadn't meant to perform. She hadn't meant to make a scene. She had just wanted to feel something real. But now, under the weight of his gaze and the gaze of everyone else, she felt exposed. She felt naked. The spell broke. A glass clinked in the back. Someone coughed. Sophie stood up abruptly, the movement jerky and clumsy. She knocked the edge of the bench, making a scraping sound that seemed horribly loud. She didn't bow. She didn't acknowledge the applause that was just starting to rumble through the room. She turned on her heel and fled, walking quickly toward the kitchen doors, her head down, hiding her face behind her hair as she tried to escape the weight of her own talent. The kitchen doors swung shut behind Sophie, cutting off the sounds of the dining room like a heavy iron curtain. The sudden change in atmosphere was jarring. In the dining room, the air had been still, filled with the ghost of the melody. But in here, it was chaotic and loud. The hiss of the grill, the sharp clanging of metal pans, and the shouted orders of the chef rushed at her all at once. Sophie leaned back against the stainless steel counter, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her palms over her ears to block out the noise. She could still feel the vibration of the piano keys under her fingertips, a ghostly sensation that refused to fade. For a few minutes, she had been flying. She had been whole. Now she was just Sophie the waitress again, and the landing was hard. She looked down at her hands. They were trembling, not from fear this time, but from the aftermath of the adrenaline. She quickly balled them into fists and hid them in the pockets of her apron, afraid that someone might see them shaking and know. Sophie, where have you been? The voice belonged to the head chef, a large man with a red face who was usually shouting about something. Today he wasn't shouting. He was standing by the pass, holding a plate of food, but he wasn't looking at the plate. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen before. It wasn't anger. It was a kind of stunned reverence. I had to check on something, Sophie stammered, her voice cracking. The chef slowly lowered the plate. He wiped his hands on his apron, stepping closer. I heard it, he said quietly, ignoring the busboys rushing past him with trays of dirty dishes. We all heard it. The whole kitchen stopped, Sophie. The line cooks stopped cooking. I dropped a spoon. That was choppin'? Sophie nodded, looking at the floor, unable to meet his eyes. Yes. Just a little bit. I'm sorry. I know I shouldn't have, sorry. The chef let out a short, breathy laugh. Girl, you have nothing to be sorry for. I knew you were good with the numbers on the order pad, but I didn't know you had that in you. Why are you back here? You should be out there taking a bow. The thought of bowing made Sophie feel sick to her stomach. She didn't want applause. She didn't want people staring at her like she was a circus act. She just wanted the ground to open up and swallow her. No, she said quickly. Please, don't make a big deal out of it. It was just a moment. It won't happen again. She grabbed a pitcher of water from the counter, desperate for an excuse to move to do something normal. I have to serve, table 4. Before the chef could say anything else, she turned and pushed back through the swinging doors. She braced herself for the dining room, expecting everyone to be pointing, laughing, staring at her like she was an alien. But the room was different. The air felt heavier, charged with something electric. The conversations that had been so loud before were now hushed. People were talking in whispers, glancing over at the empty piano in the corner, then looking away. They spoke with respect, treating the space as if a saint had just passed through. Sophie kept her head down, her eyes fixed on the floor. She walked quickly, trying to be invisible again. But invisibility wasn't an option anymore. As she passed a table, a young man reached out and gently touched her arm. Excuse me, he said softly. Sophie flinched, stopping in her tracks. She expected a complaint. She expected him to ask why she had abandoned her job to play a tune. I just wanted to say, thank you. That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. I'm having a really hard week, and for a minute, I forgot about all of it. The man's eyes were sincere. There was no mockery in his face, no pity, just gratitude. Hey. Thank you, she whispered. She pulled her arm away gently and hurried toward the corner. Her stomach turned over when she saw. Table 4. Arthur was still there. He hadn't touched his food. The steak was getting cold on the plate. The wine sat untouched. He was sitting forward in his chair, his hands clasped together on the table, staring at the piano with an intensity that was unnerving. He looked like a man trying to solve a puzzle that had no answer. Sophie approached the table, her feet dragging. She felt a wave of fear wash over her. This was the man who had mocked her, the man who had humiliated her for a simple mistake. Now she had just paraded her soul in front of him, and she felt vulnerable, exposed. She had given him ammunition to hurt her even more. She placed the water pitcher on the table. More water, sir? Arthur didn't answer immediately. He slowly turned his head to look at her. His eyes were different now. The cold, sharp arrogance was gone. In its place was a deep confusion, bordering on sadness. He looked at her face, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, the tension in her jaw, the way her hands gripped the pitcher to keep them from shaking. "Oh. You," he said. His voice was raspy, lacking the command it had earlier. "You play like that, and you serve water." Sophie felt a defensive wall snap up inside her. She straightened her spine, lifting her chin. "I have to pay the bills, sir. Playing doesn't pay the rent." Arthur looked down at his plate, pushing a piece of cold meat around with his fork. "I see," he murmured. "I suppose I owe you an apology." The words hung in the air between them. Sophie was stunned. She had prepared herself for an insult, not an apology. "For what?" she asked, her voice guarded. Arthur let out a long sigh. the sound of a man who had suddenly realized he was on the wrong side of history. For earlier, I thought you were. Well, it doesn't matter what I thought. I was wrong. I was arrogant and rude. I judged a book by its cover and I missed the whole story. He looked back at the piano, then at her. I have spent 30 years building companies, making money, acquiring things. I thought that was what made a person important. I thought that because I could buy the wine, I knew the wine. Because I could buy the piano, I understood the music. He shook his head slowly. But listening to you, I realized I don't have anything you have. I have the noise, Sophie, but you have the music. Sophie felt a lump forming in her throat, unexpected and hot. She didn't know what to say. She had spent so long feeling inferior to people like Arthur, feeling that her lack of money made her less worthy. Hearing him admit that he was the one who was lacking was a shock to her system. I just play because I have to, she said softly. It keeps me going. Arthur reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. It was a sleek leather object, bursting with credit cards. He took out a $100 bill and placed it on the table, but he didn't slide it toward her. Instead, he left it sitting there, his hand resting on top of it. This is for the service, he said quietly. But I want to give you something else. Not money. I can't pay for what you gave this room today. He reached into his other pocket and pulled out a small card case. He flipped it open and took out a plain white business card. He handed it to Sophie. My brother, Arthur said, gesturing vaguely toward the ceiling. He runs the symphony, not the local one, the big hall downtown. They are looking for a grant administrator, someone to manage the arts program. It's office work, steady hours, good pay. But you get to be around the music. You get to be in the world where you belong. Sophie looked at the card. It was heavy cream-colored stock with elegant black lettering. It looked like a ticket to another life. I can't take this, she said, shaking her head. I don't have the education. I dropped out. I'm just a waitress. Arthur smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes for the first time. You are a musician who is currently working as a waitress. There is a difference. An education can be fixed. That's what money is for. I'll pay for the classes if you have to go back. Just call him. Tell him I sent you. He slid the card across the table. Sophie stared at it. It sat there between the cold steak and the expensive wine, a bridge between her world and his. Please, Arthur said. Do it for me. I need to know that something good came out of me sitting here acting like a fool. Sophie reached out with a trembling hand. Her fingers brushed against the card. It felt smooth and cool. She picked it up, holding it tight. Thank you, she whispered. Arthur picked up his wine glass, finally taking a sip. He swirled the dark red liquid, looking at it with new eyes. No, he said softly. Thank you. Sophie watched Arthur leave the restaurant. He didn't look back at her, nor did he look at the piano one last time. He walked straight toward the glass doors, his gait slower than it had been when he arrived. He pushed the door open and stepped out into the brightness of the afternoon, disappearing into the stream of people on the sidewalk. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost, or perhaps like a man who was finally realizing that he had been living in a haunted house of his own making. The silence he left behind was heavy. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of an empty room. It was the thick, suffocating silence of 100 people trying to process something that had shaken them awake. The restaurant was slowly coming back to life. The clinking of silverware returned, but it was softer now, more tentative. Voices began to murmur again, but the conversations weren't about business deals or stock prices anymore. People were talking about the music. They were talking about the girl in the black uniform who had poured her heart out onto the keys. Sophie stood by the table, her hand clutching the small cream-colored card so tightly that the corners dug into her palm. She looked down at the empty chair where Arthur had sat. The plate with the cold steak was still there, the congealed fat shining under the lights. The glass of wine was half empty. The $100 bill sat exactly where he had left it. She reached out and took the money. It felt like a lot of cash for a lunch that had barely been touched. It was too much. It was a king's ransom to her. But as she folded it and slid it into her apron pocket, she knew it wasn't a tip. It was an apology. It was the only way a man like him knew how to say, "I was wrong." She turned and walked toward the kitchen to drop off the dirty dishes, her mind racing. The card in her pocket burned against her hip. It felt radioactive. She had spent the last 3 years building a wall around herself, accepting that her life would be a series of long shifts, sore feet, and forgotten dreams. She had made peace with being invisible. It was safe being invisible. People couldn't hurt you if they didn't see you. But now, the wall had a crack in it. She pushed through the swinging doors. The chef was there, barking an order at a line cook, but he stopped when he saw her. He looked at her face, then glanced down at the empty piano visible through the service window. "Did he give you trouble?" the chef asked, his voice low and protective. "I saw him sitting there looking like he swallowed a lemon." Sophie shook her head slowly. She felt strange, like she was floating a few inches above the ground. "No," she said. He was kind. He gave me this." She pulled the card out of her pocket and showed it to him. The chef wiped his hands on his apron and took the card, squinting at the elegant lettering. "The City Symphony?" The chef looked up, his eyes wide. "This is his brother? The guy who runs the whole place?" Sophie nodded. "He said they have a job." "An office job." "With benefits." Chef stared at her for a long moment. He looked at the card, then at the girl who had been washing dishes and bussing tables for him for 2 years. He saw the way she stood, the weariness in her posture, but also the new light in her eyes. "Take it," he said, shoving the card back into her hand. "Don't even think about it." "Take it, but I can't just leave," Sophie stammered, the old fear creeping back in. "I need the rent money. I need the tips. What if I'm not good enough? What if they laugh at me?" The chef laughed, a loud, booming sound that made the other cooks turn their heads. "Sophie, did you hear what you played out there? Did you see the room? You're too good for this place. You always have been. We were just lucky you got stuck here." He reached out and patted her shoulder, a rare gesture of affection from him. "Go on. Get out of here. I'll cover your shift. But I have to finish the side work. Go." He pointed a finger toward the back exit. Sophie stood there for a second, stunned. Then a smile started to form on her lips. It wasn't the fake, polite smile she gave to customers. It was a real smile, one that reached all the way to her eyes. She turned and ran to the staff room, her heart hammering with a different kind of rhythm, now not fear, but hope. She grabbed her bag and stuffed her uniform into her locker. She didn't bother to take off her apron yet. She just wanted to go. She needed to feel the air. She needed to breathe. She burst out the back exit of the restaurant, stepping into the alleyway. It was cramped and smelled of garbage and old cardboard, but to her it smelled like freedom. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the brick walls. She took the card out of her pocket again. She read the name on it. She remembered the way Arthur had looked at her, not with judgment, but with a strange sort of humility. He had realized that his money couldn't buy what she had. In that moment, by the piano, the power dynamic had flipped completely. The rich man was poor, and the poor girl was rich. She pulled out her phone with shaking fingers. She had to call. She had to know if this was real, or just some strange dream brought on by exhaustion and stress. The phone rang 3 times. Each ring felt like a lifetime. "Hello," a deep, gravelly voice answered. It sounded like Arthur, but warmer. "Hi," Sophie said, her voice coming out as a squeak. She cleared her throat. "My name is Sophie. I'm calling about the administrative position. A man at the bistro gave me your card. Arthur." The silence on the other end of the line was thick. She held her breath, waiting for him to laugh, to hang up, to tell her it was a mistake. "Arthur gave you my card?" The man's voice changed. It became incredulous, then soft. "My brother doesn't give out my card. He doesn't give anyone anything." "He said you play?" "Yes. I played a little today. Heard about it," the man said, and she could hear a smile in his voice. "My assistant called me 10 minutes ago. She said a waitress stopped the entire lunch rush with a Chopin nocturne. said it made her cry. Sophie leaned against the brick wall, her knees feeling weak. I just needed to play. Can you come in tomorrow? He asked. 8 o'clock? Tomorrow? Yes. Don't wear a uniform. Just come. We'll talk. The line went dead. Sophie stood there in the alley looking at her phone. It had taken less than a minute. A minute to dismantle 3 years of hopelessness. She walked out of the alley and onto the main street. The city was bustling, full of people rushing home from work, full of noise and life. She looked at the expensive cars driving by, the glass skyscrapers towering above her. For years, she had felt like an intruder in this city, someone who didn't belong in the grand scheme of things. She felt small, insignificant, and easily ignored. But as she walked toward the subway station, her steps felt lighter. The weight on her shoulders was gone. Arthur had been right. She wasn't just a waitress. She was a musician. She had a voice, and for the first time in a long time, someone had listened. She thought about the piano she had left behind in the restaurant. It was silent again, waiting for the next player. But she knew she would carry the sound of it with her. She would carry the feeling of the keys under her fingers, the vibration in her chest, the look on Arthur's face when he realized he had been wrong. She wasn't rich yet. She didn't have a fancy watch or a suit. But she had the card in her pocket, and she had the music in her heart. And for the first time in her life, Sophie realized that was enough. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was about to start living. She descended the stairs into the subway. The noise of the train rumbling up from the dark tunnel like a beast waking up. She didn't mind the noise today. She stepped onto the platform, humming a melody that only she could hear, ready for whatever came next.